Hello and welcome to the Safety Artisan, where you will find safety training resources and pragmatic, professional and impartial advice therein. Well, let's hope so anyway. So today it is Christmas Eve. It's the 24th of December 2019 and I have a special show for you today. So what we've got, I shall just move myself out of the way a bit there. What we have is a Brexit Christmas special for you. And the reason for that, as I'm sure you are well aware, is events in the UK. And this is a free full-length show. I think it's going to be about 30 minutes, just to let you know. So in those 30 minutes, we're going to compare the British and Australian approaches to safety. Now, there we go. So what we're going to cover, we're going to talk about the similarities and differences between Australian and British legislation on safety guidance that's available from the various authorities. The different jurisdictions in the UK and Australia. It's not really an issue in the UK, but certainly is in Australia. So that's something we need to go through. Talk about regulators and the different approaches to regulation. And finally, some cultural issues. And if I may mention the dreaded EU, it's worth talking about a little bit about that too, because there are still significant links between the EU and UK on how safety is done, which Australians might find helpful. So now, where's Michael Bublé when I need him to sing the song? Yeah, it's looking a lot like Brexit. With the Conservatives winning in the UK, they've passed the Brexit Act. It looks like it's finally going to happen. Now, whether you think that's a good idea or not, I'm not going to debate that. You'll be pleased to hear. You're sick of that, I'm sure. There are going to be some safety professionals and other engineering professionals who were working in the EU and who maybe won't be able to do so easily anymore. And there might be some Brits thinking, well, maybe this is an opportunity, this is a prompt for me to think about moving to Australia and seeing what life is like there. And conversely, there may be Aussies seeking opportunities in the UK, because if the flow of professionally qualified engineers and so forth from the EU countries dries up or slows down, then there might be more opportunity for Aussies. And indeed, the UK has been talking about introducing an Australian style points-based immigration system. And indeed, I think we might see a favourable treaty between UK and Australia before too long. And of course, yes, there may be some Aussies looking for opportunities in the EU, which were previously filled by Brits. So the merry-go-round continues to go round, doesn't it? Okay, so what I've got to contribute here, I spent quite a few years in the UK as a safety engineer and safety consultant, and I worked on a lot of international projects. So I did a lot of projects in the UK. I worked on a lot of UK procurements of American equipment, and I also worked very closely with German and Italian and Spanish colleagues on the Eurofighter for quite a few years, 13 years on and off. And I've quite a bit of experience of working in Germany, and also some of working with the French. So I've got, I think, quite a reasonable view of different approaches to safety and how the UK differs from and is similar to our European counterparts. And also, of course, 7 years ago, I emigrated to Australia. So I went through that points-based process, fortunately with a firm to back me up. and I made the transition from doing UK style safety to Australian style safety. So let's get on with it. So there are very many similarities between Australian and UK approaches to safety. Australia has learned a lot from the UK and continues to be very close to the UK in many ways, particularly in our style of law and legislation. But there are differences, and I'm mainly going to talk about the differences. So let's look at that. So first of all, in the UK, we've had the Health and Safety at Work Act around since 1974. And that's the kind of executive act that sets up the Health and Safety Executive, the HSE, as a regulator, gives it teeth, and also enables further legislation and regulations. Now, if I was still in the UK, the next thing we would talk about would be, in any discussion about health and safety at work, would be the six-pack. Now, these were actually EU directives. There were six EU directives that the UK converted into UK regulations, as indeed all member states were required to. And incidentally, the UK was very successful in influencing EU safety policy. So it's a bit ironic that we're now turning our back on that. Anyway, what you will find in the six-pack, first of all, there's the regulations on management of health and safety at work, otherwise known as HSG 65. And there's a lot of good advice in there on how to do risk management. That is broadly equivalent for an Aussie audience to the Risk Management Code of Practice. Okay, so a lot of similar things in there that it's trying to achieve. Then we've got the Provision and Use of Work Equipment Regulations, or PUWER. You'd probably often see it written as PUWER for short. So that's saying if you provide equipment for workers, it's got to be fit for purpose. Then there are regulations on manual handling, on workplace health, safety and welfare, on personal protective equipment at work, and on the health and safety of display screen equipment of the kind that I'm using here and now. I'm sat in my EU regulated chair with 5 legs and certain mandatory adjustablenesses. Now, again, Aussies will be sat there looking at the list going, well, that looks awfully familiar. We just, package it up slightly differently, and that's true. There's also, it should be said, a separate act called the Control of Major Accident Hazards, or COMA, as it's known. And that was introduced after the Piper Alpha disaster in the North Sea, which claimed, sadly, 167 lives in a single accident. And that covers big installations that could cause, in theory, a mass casualty accident. So that's the UK approach. Now, the Australian approach is actually much simpler in that the Aussies have had time to look at UK legislation, take the essentials from it, but actually boil it down into its essence quite cleverly. So there is a single Work Health and Safety Act, which was signed up in 2011 and came into force on the 1st of January 2012. And there are a single set of WHS regulations that go hand in hand with the Act, and they cover a wide spectrum of stuff. So a lot of the things in the UK that you would see covered in different acts and different regulations are all covered in the one place. So not only does it address, as you would expect, the workplace responsibilities of employers and employees, etc., but there are also upstream duties in the WHS Act on designers and manufacturers and suppliers and importers and so forth. So the WHS Act pulls all of these things together quite elegantly into one very readable act. And I have to say, it's one of the few pieces of legislation that I think a non-legal, non-lawyer, sorry, can read, and it makes sense. But you've got to read what it says, not what you think it says, just word of caution. And so the regulations in themselves cover major hazard facilities, so rather like the COMA regulations. So they're all included as well. But it's worth noting that Australian WHS, unlike the UK, does not differentiate between safety and security. So if somebody gets hurt, then it doesn't matter whether it was an accident or whether it was a malicious act. If it happens to a worker, then WHS covers it. And so that puts obligations on employers to look after the security of workers, which is an interesting difference. The UK law approach generally does not do that. And actually, we're seeing more prosecutions, I'm told by the lawyers, for harm caused by criminal acts than we are yet, anyway, seeing many prosecutions on safety accidents. And so that's the Act and the regulations. It's also worth saying that Australia has a system of codes of practice, just as the UK has approved codes of practice. Now, that's all I'm going to say for now. There are other videos and resources on the website that go into the Act and regulations and COP. I'm going to do a whole series on all of those things, unpacking them one by one, but here is just a summary for now. So let's think about exceptions for a moment, because the way that just move that slightly, the way that the UK and Australia do exceptions to their health and safety legislation is slightly different. So in the UK, Health and Safety at Work Act explicitly does not apply to ships and aircraft moving under their own power. Okay, that's quite clear. That kind of division does not occur in Australia. Also, Health and Safety Act does not apply to special forces or to combat operations by the armed forces or the work-up to combat operations. And again, those exclusions do not exist in Australia. And then it's also worth saying there are many other acts enforced by the UK HSE. It's not just about health and safety at work and the six-pack and COMA. There's a lot of regs and stuff on mining and offshore, you name it. The UK is a complex economy, and there's lots of historical laws going back up to 100 years. I think the Explosives Act was in 1898 that's still being enforced. Now in Australia, there's a different approach. They've with WHS, they've taken a clean sweep, a very different approach, as we'll see later. And there are only really 3 explicit exclusions to the Act. So it says that WHS doesn't apply to merchant ships. That's covered by the OSHME Act, the Occupational Safety and Health of Merchant. I've forgotten what the I stands for now. Anyway, whatever. So merchant ships doesn't apply to offshore petroleum installations. More on that later. And there's a separate act that deals with radiation protection, and that is enforced by the ARPANSA, the Australian Radiation and Safety Protection Agency. And Nuclear Agency, ARPANSA, another mouthful of an acronym. So slightly different approach to what is not and what is covered and what is not, but very similar in the essentials. And one of those essentials is the determination of how much safety is enough. So we've got In the UK, the HSE talks about LARP, and in Australia, the Act talks about SAFARP. And this quote here is directly from the UK HSE website. And basically it says a LARP and SAFARP are essentially the same things. And the core concept is what is reasonably practicable. And actually that is what's defined in the WHS Act. Now it's worth mentioning that the HSE say this because it was the HSE who invented the term a LARP. Because if you look in UK legislation, you will see SAFARP and you will see other terms like all practical measures or all reasonable measures and stuff like that. There are various phrases in UK laws to say how much is enough. And so the HSE said, right, doesn't matter what it says in the law, the test we will use is a LARP and it covers all of these things. So it was always intended to be essentially the same as SAFARP. Now, there is some controversy in Australia about that. There's some people who think that LARP and SAFARP are different. The truth is that in Australia, as in the UK, people did a LARP badly. They did it wrong. And sure, if you do a LARP wrong, it's not SAFARP, okay, and it's different. But if you're doing a LARP properly, it is the same, okay. Now, there are some people who will die in a ditch in order to disagree with me over that, but I'm quoting you from the HSE who invented the term to describe SAFARP, okay. So this is not negotiable, I'm afraid. I'm not discussing this. So it's also worth noting that WHS uses the term SAFARP, but for example, the offshore regulator NOPSEMA, which is the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Agency, NOPSEMA, they use the term LARP because they've got a separate act to WHS for enforcing safety on offshore platforms. But again, even though they're using a LARP, it's exactly the same as SAFARP. If you look at the way that NOPSEMA explain a LARP, they do it properly, and it matches up with SAFARP. In fact, the NOPSEMA guidance is very good. Again, more on regulators later. But just a little aside, and you'll see why in a moment, before we can get to talking about regulators, I need to tell you about where you can get guidance in Australia. Now, in the UK, you've got the HSE, who are the regulator and the enforcer, and they also provide a lot of guidance. And again, anybody, safety engineer or safety professional in the UK will immediately think of a document called R2P2, which is short for reducing risk, protecting people. So reducing risk, protecting people, R2P2. Okay, and that's an 80-something page document in which the HSE explain their rationale for how they will enforce safety law and safety regulations and what they mean by a LARP and so on and so forth. There's also a lot of guidance on their website as well, which is excellent and copyright free. So, sorry, I apologize. It's not copyright free, but it's available under Creative Commons. So you can do an awful lot with it. Now, in Australia, it's a little bit more complex than that. So WHS Act actually was drawn up by Safe Work Australia, which is a statutory agency of the government. It's not a regulator and it does not regulate. But it was SWA who developed the model WHS Act, the model regulations and the model codes of practice. Okay, more on that in just a second. And it's Safe Work Australia that provide a lot of good guidance on their website. So a lot of good stuff on there. Now, most Australian regulators will refer you always to legislation. We've got a bit of an American approach in that respect in Australia, in that you can't do anything without a lawyer to tell you what you can and can't do. Or that's the way that some government agencies seem to approach it, sadly. The idea that people can, that the regulator is actually there to bridge the gap and explain safety to the ordinary people so they can just get on with it, that kind of passes some organisations by. I've got to be careful here because I still work for some of them. Now, some regulators in Australia, particularly, say, New South Wales state regulator or Victorian regulator, do provide good guidance for use within their jurisdiction. And that is the red flashing lights and the sirens should be going off at this point, because we have a jurisdiction issue in Australia. And we'll come on to that now. So, in the UK, it's reasonably simple. You've got the HSE for England and Wales, you've got the HSE for Scotland, and you've got the HSE for Northern Ireland. And they are enforcing essentially the same act and the same regulations right across the United Kingdom. Now, there are differences in law. England and Wales has a legal system, Scotland has a slightly different legal system, and then Northern Ireland has a peculiar legal system of its own, but they're all related. Okay, there are historical reasons why they're different, but essentially from a safety point of view, all of those three regulators do the same thing and work in order to maintain consistency. Okay. In Australia, it's a bit different. So Australia is a federated nation. So we have states and territories. As you can see, we've got Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. And then within New South Wales, we've got the ACT, that's the Australian Capital Territory. So Canberra, the Australian national capital, it actually sits in its own territory, but the territory itself is a territory. It's not part of it. It's not national. Anyway, weird, but never mind. So, and the vast majority of Australians live on that east coast. So down the coast of Queensland, NSW, and Victoria. Then we've got Tasmania, South Australia, where I live, the Northern Territory, and Western Australia. Now, all of those states and territories enforce their own safety law and regulations. And then on top of that, you've got the national approach to safety as well. Now, this will be a bit of a puzzle to Brits, but in Australia we call the national government that's based in Canberra, we call that the Commonwealth. So Brits are used to the Commonwealth being 100 and something countries that used to belong to the UK, but now we're a club. But in Australia, the Commonwealth is the national government, is the federal government. Okay, so just to explain that, because that really did my head in when I moved here, but that's how it is. Now, so let's talk about regulators. So let's start at the national level. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, we have got Comcare. So they are the national regulator who enforce WHS for the Commonwealth of Australia. So for all federal issues. Okay, so what are federal issues? So federal workplaces, they are defence, any land that's owned by the Commonwealth, any things like defence where you've got a national system that's running, and you've also got some nationalised or semi-nationalised industries that are effectively belong to the Commonwealth or set up by national regulations, and they operate and they will operate to the Commonwealth version of WHS. Okay. Then you've got the Northern Territory, Tasmania, South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, and the Australian Capital Territory, which is a territory, it's not part of the Commonwealth. And all of those states and territories have their own versions of the model WHS Act regulations and COP. They're not all identical to the model, but they're pretty much very, very similar. And there are slight differences in the way that things are enforced. For example, in South Australia, there's a couple of codes of practice that Safe Work SA have said they will not enforce, okay, because that's the decision that's been made in the SA Parliament. Now, generally speaking, these differences don't actually change the price of fish, okay? All of these regulators have their own jurisdiction. They're all doing more or less the same thing as the Commonwealth WHS. So if you start with the model WHS Act or the Commonwealth version, you won't be far off what's going on in those states and territories. However, you do have to remember that if you're doing non-Commonwealth work in those states and territories, you know, everything else, industry, transport, you name it, you're going to be under the jurisdiction of the state or territory regulator. It's going to be different. Right. So that's that. That's the easy stuff. Right. Unfortunately, not all states have adopted WHS yet. Okay. So Western Australia, bottom left-hand corner, I've put a dashed line around there. They are going to implement WHS. It's not there yet at this time in December 2019. So they're heading towards WHS, not got there yet. They're still using their old occupational health and safety legislation from about 1999, I think. It's a similar story in Victoria. Victoria, for some reason, have decided that they're not going to implement WHS, even though everybody agreed that they would. And they're going to stick with their Occupational Health and Safety at Work Act, which, again, I think dates from something like 1999. But these things are amended and kept up to date. So at the moment, Victoria has no plans to implement WHS. Now, you, like me, might be sat there thinking, what a ridiculous way to organise yourself. We're a nation of less than 25 million people, and we've got all this complexity about regulators and how we regulate. And yes, it is daft. WHS was an attempt to get away from that stupidity. It's mostly been successful, I have to say. It's mostly been successful. I think we will get there one day. But that's the situation that we've got in Australia. Now, a quick little piece here. Just a sample of regulators in the UK and Australia, just to compare. Okay, I can't go through them all because there are a lot. And I wanted to illustrate the similarities and differences. And there are many, many similarities. For Brits coming to Australia or Aussies going to UK, you will find a regulatory system that in most part looks and feels pretty familiar. So in the UK, for example, you've got the Civil Aviation Authority who regulate non-military flying, airports, etc., etc. In Australia, you've got the Civil Aviation and Safety Authority, which does almost exactly the same thing. Now, in the UK, you've got the Air Accident Investigation Branch, who they do what the name implies. And in Australia, you've got the Australian Transportation Safety Bureau, which also investigates air accidents. It does maritime accidents as well, by the way. The ATSB in Australia is somewhat modelled on the American ATSB, very similar approach and ethos and the way they do business. But, you know, similar structures. Now, when we get onto the maritime side, it's quite different. In the UK, you've got the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, or MCGA, I think it's often abbreviated, to regulate civil maritime traffic and health and safety on merchant ships, and they also investigate accidents and stuff. Well, in Australia, don't forget we've got the ATSB looking at maritime accidents and publishing those statistics. We've then got the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, the AMSA, who look at the design aspects of safety of ships. These are all national regulators, by the way, federal Commonwealth regulators. You've then got Seacare, who look at the OH&S workplace aspects of working on maritime merchant ships. And then separately, we've got the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Authority, NOPSEMA, who look after oil rigs and gas rigs, basically, that sit more than 3 nautical miles offshore. Because if they're inside 3 nautical miles, then that's the jurisdiction of the local state or territory. And indeed, NOPSEMA is evidence of the government trying to get all the states and territories to come together. They succeeded with WHS, more or less. With the offshore stuff, the states and territories refused to cooperate with the Commonwealth government. And this is a common theme in Australia. The different branches of the government seem to delight in fighting each other rather than serving the Australian public. Anyway, sorry, got a bit political there. I'll stop that. And so the Commonwealth just says, right, this is stupid. We cannot develop offshore on this basis. It's not going to happen. So they set up NOPSEMA, and they just said, out of state and territory jurisdiction, we are going to unilaterally apply this, and we're going to set up the NOPSEMA regulator. Bang, suck on that, states and territories. And NOPSEMA are actually a very good regulator. And of course, well, you have to be in that regime, otherwise you die. Okay, so let's look a little bit at culture. So what we have got, let's face it, Australians and Brits and Americans as well in many ways are very similar. We have an Anglo-Saxon approach, and Australian and British law are very similar, come from a common root. We've got a very approach to law, I've said, and humour, and that's very important when trying to do safety, is having a sense of humour. And especially in defence, so, you know, anything to do with the Commonwealth, you've got the Five Eyes countries, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the US and Canada, who have worked closely together for several decades. So there's a lot of commonality between these English-speaking countries that have some kind of, you know, common Anglo-Saxon colonial past. However, big difference in Australia, we are much more heavily influenced by the US than the UK. So you'll find a lot of a US style certification against specification approach in Australia in different industries and that kind of thinking. And that's subtly different to the UK and Australian legal approach, which is based on a safety by intent idea. So the idea with UK law and also Australia has inherited these essential traits is that you're safe if you're keeping people safe. So a contract, specification, these mean very little. Are people actually kept safe? And that's the way that that's the essential idea behind UK and Australian law. And that's a bit different to the sort of American approach of, you know, specifications and requirements. There's nothing wrong with either approach. They're just different. Mixing them together does cause confusion. Now, it does that in the UK. If you work, as I did for most of my working life in the UK, in aviation, aviation is an international enterprise essentially, and it works off a US style safety by specification approach or certification approach, because civil aviation is essentially US led from 1944 Chicago Convention onwards. So if you try and mix the two together, they can cause confusion, and it's important to understand the difference. And there's a lot more of this US certification influence in Australia than there is in the UK. Okay, so just to be aware of that, whichever way you're traveling. Okay. So actually, I'm just going to go back. I can find one. I'm just going to go back. That covers the Australia versus the UK in about 35 minutes. I'm a little bit over, so apologies for that. We've talked about, I've given our different aspects. I can't go into all the details on everything. The simple truth is I don't know all the details on everything. I'm just not an expert in all domains. Nobody is. But I hope I've given you a useful overview of differences for, British engineers wanting to be aware of safety in Australia and Aussies wanting to go to the UK. Now, it's also worth mentioning, while we're on the subject, just one slide on the EU, because there are, the UK has been part of the EU for a long time, and UK legislation has been heavily influenced by the EU and vice versa. As I said earlier, the UK has been quite successful in influencing EU directives, which the UK then turns into law and regulations, as the other EU nations do. So actually, that's the second bullet point. If you go and work in the EU, you should find local laws that implement the EU directives in common with UK. Okay. The big difference between the UK and the other EU states is ALARP, this measure of how much safety is enough. And that is unique to the UK, so much so actually that other EU nations actually took the UK to court in the European Court of Arbitration, saying that ALARP was a sort of anti-competitive variation that shouldn't be allowed. Now, they lost, and ALARP stands in the UK, but just illustrates that there are a lot of similarities, but one or two critical differences, and ALARP is probably the most important one. Now, sorry, if I go back to the first bullet point, in English, we differentiate between safety and security. Now, I've mentioned that UK health and safety law differentiates quite strongly on that. WHS does not do that, deliberately, I guess. So whether it's accidental harm or malicious harm doesn't matter to WHS. You've got to protect your workers. That's not the same in the UK. And in many European countries, the word for safety and security are one and the same thing. So if you go to Germany, Sicherheit is safety and security. Similarly, in Sécurité in France and the variations thereof in all the Romance languages. So safety and security are the same word in many European languages, and it does cause a slightly different approach. Okay. Now, having said that, of course, a lot of these EU economies where you might be thinking of working are modern economies with lots of international regulated or internationally common stuff going on. The aviation industry, for example, but there are lots of advanced industries that are regulated in a similar way right around the world for good reason. And so you'll still find all of those things, alive and well in different EU countries. So there's lots of similarities as well as a few key differences. Now, culturally, I've spent a lot of time working with Germans, on safety, where Germans tend to come unstuck with the Anglo-Saxon approach to safety, is Germans have the mentality that they make things to work, not to fail. So to Germans, and German engineers especially, the Anglo-Saxon fixation with looking at how things could go wrong seems very strange to them. And they often just don't get it unless they've been in an industry like aviation, where that approach has been inculcated into them. So in Germany, you've often got a gulf to bridge there. They often don't understand Australian WHS because it's just not their mentality. They don't build things to fail, they build them to work. So maybe safety too will take off in Germany because of that different approach. In France, I have to say the French are extremely competent engineers and they're very good at safety, but they do it their way. They do it the French way, which is different to the UK, different to Australia. Don't expect the French to do it your way. They're going to do it their way, and you need to understand what they do, how they do it, and why they do it that way. France is in many ways a very nationalized country. It's a really national enterprise. Most engineers go through the one system, and in fact there is one top college for engineering in France, and so there's a very there's one way of doing it in France. It's a very nationalized enterprise, which may come as a bit of a shock to Aussies, given the somewhat how can I put this, here and there approach to regulation that we've got in Australia. So French, yeah, they're competent, but don't expect them to comply with the Aussie or the UK way of doing things. And then I've said variations across Southern Europe. This is I'm trying to be tactful here because a lot of Southern European approach to safety is very variable. In some ways, I've been very impressed, say, at watching how the Spanish do business. But in other countries, I mean, I'm half Italian. The Italian approach to safety can be a bit of a shocker. So if you're buying stuff from Italy, don't assume, even if in the contract the Italians have said they'll do X, Y, Z and they'll produce safety reports, blah, blah, blah. Just because they've said so in the contract doesn't mean A, that it's actually going to happen, or B, doesn't mean the stuff they produce is going to be worth the paper it's written on, quite frankly. So in different countries in Southern Europe, there's going to be, a variable approach, let's say. And so, as I say, some countries are very, very good in certain areas, not so much in others. Right, I'll stop that before my passport gets cancelled. Okay, well, thanks for listening. So this presentation contains a little bit of information from the UK HSE and also some from Safe Work Australia. And I've produced that under the Creative Commons license. And if you go to the Safety Artisan website, www.safetyartisan.com, you will see the details of the licenses there, and you can see that I've complied with them. The content of this video presentation is copyright Safety Artisan. And then for more information, do please feel free to visit my Patreon page, where all of the safety training videos are available. A lot are free, some you have to pay a small fee to see. And that's at www.patreon.com/Safety Artisan. That's the Safety Artisan page. And then there are more resources on the safetyartisan.com website. And it just remains for me to say, I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Or indeed, whenever you see this, season's greetings, as we're coming to say in this increasingly politically correct world, but never mind. Okay, well, stay safe, and I'll see you next month. Bye-bye.